Hello mga Mathster and welcome to another tutorial video for Pre-Calculus, specifically for Trigonometry. And in this video, pag-uusapan natin ang proving trigonometric identities. This lesson is very tricky but it is very useful, especially pagdating natin sa basic calculus, kung saan susubukan nating hanapin ang derivative or integral ng isang trigonometric function. Kasi sometimes it might be difficult or impossible to differentiate or integrate it, kaya we try to express it in some other form. At ang case skill para magawa natin yon ay kailangan marunong tayo sa pagmamanipulate ng trigonometric identities. And in this lesson, magkakaroon tayo ng chance to develop such skill. So if you're ready, let's get it on! First is, i-define muna natin kung ano nga ba ang identity. And we define it as an equation na true for all the possible values in the domain. And an example of that is x squared minus 1 is equal to the product of x plus 1 and x minus 1. Sa madaling sabi, kahit ano yung ipapalit natin na value dun sa x, ay palaging true yung equation. Say, we want to replace it with the value 1. So, pag ginawa natin 1 si x, we will have a value of 0 sa left and 0 also sa right. Or if we want to replace it with 4, then this will give us 16 minus 1, that's 15. And this one is the product of 5 and 3, which is also 15. While if it's not true for all possible values in the domain, we say that the equation is conditional. And ang halimbawa nito is the equation x squared minus 1 because kung papalitan natin si x squared minus 1 ng value, say, 3, which is in the domain, dahil ang domain nito is the set of all real numbers, pag pinalitan natin si x ng 3, then what we will have is an equation that is false because this is 9 minus 1, this is 8, and it is not equal to 0. So that's identity versus conditional. Now we talk about the fundamental trigonometric identities. So we say that they are fundamental dahil sa kanila natin i-derive yung iba pang trigonometric identities later. Now, our first stop is reciprocal identities. And meron tayong tatlo. The first is, we know that the reciprocal of cosecant is sine, secant is cosine, while the reciprocal of cotangent is tangent. We have here naman the quotient identities. And we have two. The first one is tangent is the quotient between sine and cosine, while cotangent is the quotient between cosine and sine. Now we have the Pythagorean identities. And we have three under this group, but I only wrote one dahil i-derive natin yung dalawa. So our first identity is the sine squared of theta plus the square of cosine theta is equal to 1. Now, galing ito doon sa ating triangle na, right triangle na ito. So as we can see, the relationship among the sides is given by this equation. Now, what are the other two equations? Madiderive natin yung isa by dividing the whole equation by sine square theta. While the other one, madiderive naman natin if we are going to divide it by cosine square theta. So, let's do that. So, as you can see here, dinivide ko yung buong equation by sine square theta. So, this becomes 1. This becomes cotangent square theta because this is cosine over sine. While this is the inverse of cosecant square theta. So, this is our second identity under the Pythagorean identities. To obtain the third identity under this group, i-divide naman natin yung buong equation by the expression cosine square theta. And if we are going to do that, then this term will become tangent square theta, which, as you can see, this is sine over cosine. While this one is 1. And this is the inverse of secant square theta. So this is our third identity. The last group of fundamental trigonometric identities ay yung even-odd identities. And for this group, we have three. Yung first one, it says the sine of negative of an angle ay equal daw sa negative nung sine nung angle. So, para maipaliwanag yon, let's look at the illustration. And as we can see here, if the angle is positive, then magro-rotate tayo pa counterclockwise. But if it is negative, magro-rotate tayo pa clockwise naman. So, we take note that the magnitude of these angles ay pareho, which means na pareho yung lengths ng sides na ito. This one, tsaka this one. So, dahil yung ating point here ay nasa quadrant 1, then that means our y-coordinate is positive. While this one naman ay nasa quadrant 4, kaya yung y natin is negative. So, that means para maging equal yung dalawa, we have to multiply one of them by negative 1. Thus, we have this identity. Our second identity naman, it tells us na pareho yung cosine nung negative ng isang angle dun sa cosine nung angle. And using the same illustration, whether mag-rotate man tayo pa counterclockwise or pa clockwise, pareho lang naman yung x-coordinates natin. So, if positive siya here, positive rin siya rito. So, that explains this identity. Lastly, the tangent of the negative of an angle is equal naman sa negative nung tangent nung angle. So, to explain that, we have tangent of negative theta equals the ratio or quotient between sine of negative theta and cosine of negative theta. And we know that sine of negative theta is equal to negative sine theta, while cosine of negative theta, it is equal to cosine of theta. So, we have this quotient. And if we simplify that, that is equal to negative tangent theta. Now that we already know the different fundamental trigonometric identities, gagamitin na natin sila to prove some other identities. And for our first item, we want to prove that the secant of an angle minus its cosine is equal to the product of its sine and its tangent. So, ang una nating gagawin ay i-verify muna natin kung ito nga ay posibleng isang identity. To do that, we will assign a value to x or the angle. Say, we want the angle to be 60 degrees. And if x is 60 degrees, then its secant is 2, while its cosine is 1/2. Ang kanya namang sine is square root of 3 over 2, at ang kanyang tangent is square root of 3. Now, 2 minus 1/2 is equal to 3 over 2, while the product of these two expressions is also 3 over 2. Now that we have already verified that this might be an identity, pwede na nga natin siya ngayong i-prove. In proving an identity, ang pwede lang nating galawin ay yung isang side. So, pipili tayo sa left hand at sa right hand kung ano yung sa tingin natin ay mas convenient na galawin. At ang goal natin ay mapalabas na equal nga yung side na yon dun sa other side. For this particular item, I am choosing the left hand side at siya ang aking gagalawin at gusto kong maipakita sa inyo na equal nga siya rito. So, my first step will be to express secant theta as 1 over cosine theta because I know that yung secant ay reciprocal ni cosine. Next is, gagawin ko namang single expression yung terms natin sa kaliwa dahil nga yung pinupuntahan natin is a single expression. So, ang LCD ng dalawa ay cosine x. Cosine x divided by cosine x, that's 1 times 1, this is 1. Cosine x divided by, ang denominator nito is 1. Cosine x divided by 1 is cosine x times cosine x, that will be cosine square x. Then, papalitan ko si 1 minus cosine square x ng sine square x. Galing yan dun sa identity na sine square x plus cosine square x equals 1. From this fraction, i-extract ko naman si sine x. Lastly, this quotient is equal to tan x. So we have just proven that this is an identity. In our second item, we want to prove naman that the tangent of an angle plus its cotangent is equal to the product of its cosecant and its secant. So for this item, ang gagalawin ko ay yung left-hand side. And my first step is, i-express ko si tan at cotan in terms of sine and cosine. Dahil yung gusto kong puntahan are the reciprocals nung dalawa. So maybe, if maipakita ko ito in terms of sine and cosine, ay makakita ako ng way para mapunta ako dito sa form na ito. Next is, I will simplify yung expression sa left-hand side into a single expression. Kaya ko gagawin yon dahil nga yung pinupuntahan ko ay single expression lamang. At this point, pwede kong palitan tong expression na sine square x plus cosine square x na 1 because we have that identity. Now, I will write this expression as product of two fractions. Lastly, I will write 1 over cosine x as secant x while 1 over sine x is cosecant x. And by doing that, makikita natin na equal nga itong left-hand side dito sa ating right-hand side. Now we have just proven another identity. For our last item, gusto naman natin i-prove that this sum is equal to twice the cosecant square of a theta. So our first step here is we will try to express yung sum into a single expression. Dahil nga yung pinupuntahan natin is a single expression. Next is, pwede nating i-simplify yung numerator. And what we'll have is 2. Dahil makakancel yung cosine theta and the negative cosine theta. So we have 1 plus 1 and that is 2. Then, pwede na rin natin isabay yung pagsisimplify ng denominator. Because the product of 1 minus cosine theta and 1 plus cosine theta is 1 minus cosine square theta. And then, pwede natin palitan si 1 minus cosine square theta na sine square theta. Galing yan dun sa identity ulit natin na sine square theta plus cosine square theta equals 1. So what we will have at this point, we know that this is a product of 2 and 1 over sine square theta. And we know that 1 over sine square theta is equal to cosecant square theta. So, this one, pwede na nating isulat na 2 times cosecant square theta. So, we have just proven another identity. So, before we end, let me leave some tips tungkol sa pagpuprove ng trigonometric identities. Mahalagang maunawaan natin na walang definite na steps or number of steps para ma-prove ang isang identity. Ang importante ay makarecognize tayo ng pattern at magamit natin appropriately yung mga alam nating fundamental identities. Sa pagpili naman ng side na gagalawin, mas maigi or mas advisable kung ang gagamitin natin ay yung mukhang complex. Siyempre, makakatulong din kung intact yung ating foundational knowledge on trigonometry. Like, kung ano ang ibig sabihin ng sine, cosine, tangent, at the other trigonometric ratios. So, yun ay ilan lamang sa mahalagang information at tips tungkol sa proving trigonometric identities. Sana ay marami kayong natutunan sa video natin na ito. At salamat sa panonood. See you sa susunod na video.